So Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela Bay, Ekurhuleni and Rustenburg have finally elected and formed their metro councils. It followed weeks of post-local government election uncertainty and somewhat chaotic last-minute coalition deals. Yesterday's first council sitting saw the ANC losing key metros, Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni, to its arch-rival, the Democratic Alliance. Let's unpack all of these issues for you now. We're joined by political analyst Tessa Dooms as we talk about the future of these coalition governments in these metros. Tessa, good morning. It's great to have you with us on the show this morning. I don't know about you, but I'm all coalitioned out from all the discussions leading up from the election results being announced to these inaugural council sittings. So, big losses for the African National Congress, specifically in Gauteng this morning. Perhaps not surprising, those losses. What is surprising, though, is who chose to vote alongside the DA.
Yes, good morning, Michelle. I think that yesterday was a very important day in the history of our democracy because we really saw not only the way in which a multi-party democracy lends itself to coalitions, but we also saw the ways in which our system makes sure that every vote counts, regardless of how big or small the parties are that you vote for. I mean, I think in the lead up to the election, many parties, particularly the DA, fear-mongered around small parties and don't give your vote will be wasted. And yesterday we saw the formation and the surprise formation of a coalition of quote-unquote small parties that really determined the future of many of the metros. I would say even the Nelson Mandela Bay metro that the ANC won. And this really tells us that it wasn't as much about the DA winning yesterday. It was about the ANC losing, but it was also about a realignment of our politics that reminds us that there's no wasted vote in this country's system, and that parties that are deemed small, even after election day and at the polls, can wield those votes in ways that are meaningful. And now we need to think about what the future of these coalitions and these marriages, truly in this case of inconvenience, will hold for governance in these metros.
And certainly Action SA's Herman Mashaba also echoing the kinds of sentiments that you've just outlined, Tessa, insofar as he says, you know, where Action SA has voted with the Democratic Alliance, it wasn't necessarily to support the party, but rather, as you say, in support of multi-party democracy.
Yes, and I would take it a step further. I almost think that in some ways it was a way to keep the DA in check. I think what we saw over the weekend was the DA really turning away from its traditional coalition partners that it had in 2016, and parties feeling disrespected by the way the DA engaged them. And so instead of going to the DA and saying, well, we will lend you our votes, what essentially has happened is those parties have forced a marriage with the DA where the DA's majorities are not big enough for them to pass budgets by themselves, to make many decisions by themselves. And it's going to be interesting whether or not the DA can recognize that it did not secure its own wins yesterday, not by the vote at the ballot, nor by the negotiation table at the coalitions. But these wins have been imposed on them, and what they're going to have to give back in return remains to be seen. But certainly they will not be able to run these metros that they've got through these coalitions yesterday by themselves. And even what happens today in Tshwane, it would be interesting to know if the DA proactively goes to the negotiating tables before Tshwane today to strengthen its position, because a win in these cases doesn't always mean that you as the DA, because you have the seat, have all of the power.
So Tessa, explain that to us, because, you know, there are now coalitions in place where there are no coalition agreements. What are the risks associated with that?
Yeah, it's really important to make a distinction between coalitions and voting together, voting on the same side in the same block. I think there is a coalition that formed yesterday, but I don't think it's one that includes the DA. So there's a coalition of smaller parties that got below what the DA did, and they coalesced to vote on the DA side. But the DA wasn't privy to that. We heard Helen Ziller make that clear. We saw that Mpho Phalatse made that clear as well. They didn't know what happened yesterday. And so the fallout of this is twofold. One is that the DA itself will need to go to this coalition that has formed, and they will need to see if they can work together so that they can make decisions about how the mayoral councils are going to be structured, the executives. They're going to have to make decisions about budgets, about priorities, and so it brings the DA effectively back to the negotiation table, either on a case-by-case basis, which has always been the EFF's preference rather than formalized coalitions. But also this is, again, something that our democracy allows for. If we think about even in Parliament, usually debates in legislation are very much ceremonial because we know what the numbers are. We know that there's a party that has a majority. And so regardless if other parties in their debate speeches disagree, put forward other arguments, it usually doesn't matter. In this case, it absolutely matters that people are able to convince each other. So it actually gives real meaning and significance to the way our systems are structured, because those debates will now actually have great effect, and particularly at local government level, where participation of voters and citizens in the 5 years for things like budgets and IDPs is absolutely crucial.
Shall we take a look at what Julius Malema had to say around the issue of the EFF voting alongside the Democratic Alliance? As you say, the federal chairperson, Helen Zille, saying that she was surprised. She did not expect the vote to go the way it did. Paul Palatse saying much of the same thing. I mean, it was arranged, it was planned back in 2016 when the EFF and the DA were in a coalition together in Nelson Mandela Bay, in the metro there. Obviously not planned this time around. We know what unfolded in the Nelson Mandela Bay metro. I mean, Julius Malema's words, and I wonder what the voter will be thinking about this. He says, without the EFF, this is in the wake of yesterday, without the EFF, the DA will not be able to govern. Its reputation that where it governs better will be tested by us. How do we read that? That's scary if I'm part of that municipality.
I don't think that it's scary if you're part of the municipality. It might be scary if you're a DA voter. But if you're part of the municipality, it's important to read those words to mean two things. One is that there needs to be cooperation between parties, and that the DA is not going to be able to make its own decisions on its own terms. I think one of the ways in which the coalitions that the DA led in 2016 didn't work was that the DA assumed that leading a coalition gave it more power than everybody else at the table in all instances. And I think that was a failure to recognize that other parties can really shift dynamics. And it happened in even the city of Joburg, where you saw the coalition move from the DA to the ANC in order to teach the DA that it needs to respect its coalition partners. But the second thing that's most important about what Malema is saying there is that now there's an opportunity, even within the governing structure, for actual checks, balances, and accountability.
Yeah.
When you have one party that has got an overwhelming majority, they are self-regulating to a large extent, with the opposition only able to push back on decisions once they're made. In this context, the decision-making process of this majority that has been formed is going to be one that's going to be implicitly accountable. They're going to have to account to many parties in order to make decisions.
Yeah.
And I think that's healthier for our democracy as opposed to bad.
Yeah.
Where it will fall apart is if there's a lack of maturity, if the interests of people are not put first by the DA, by the EFF, or anybody, and if we see politicians that are really trying to posture for 2024 rather than govern effectively today.
It's the word coalition. It's the word coalition really being put to the test.
Absolutely. And this is actually where the political skills that politicians claim to have really will be tested. Because even when you're thinking about what politicians need to do to form their own parties, they need to learn to coalesce. So no matter what party you're in, if you're in a party, there are different people who have different perspectives, different views, and you need to find each other and you need to find a way to work together in a common interest. You need to take those same skills and apply them to intra-party coalitions. You need to apply them to these coalitions that go across divides and find common ground. And in this case, the common ground must be what's good for the citizens in those metros. It must be service delivery, and it must not be what the party sees and its interest and its political posturing for the future.
And do we have those skills, Tessa? Do we have the skills that put the voter first, that put service delivery first, where I'm not posturing for the next election and for my party's performance next time around?
I will say thus far we've not seen much of that given our coalition history. It's a short history, granted, but we haven't seen much of that. And we saw how spectacularly things have fallen apart in different ways in different metros. But as the voters in this country, this is what we need to be paying attention to. We need to ask ourselves, what skills do we want political leaders to have, our public representatives to have, our politicians to have, that will inspire confidence that we are at the heart of their decision making. We need to be really holding them to account and saying, what was the basis of your decision? Where do I fit in? When are you going to come to me and make sure that my interests are represented? So there's as much a role for us as the ordinary citizen that's not in those rooms of power, as it is for the political party to make sure all of this works the way that it should. And if it doesn't, we must hold parties to account, hold them responsible, and show them at the polls how we felt about that.
And arguably that's exactly what we've done in these local government elections, isn't it? I mean, Ekurhuleni brings to an end 2-decade governance by the ANC, with Tanya Campbell being voted in as mayor there. When we talk about posturing for 2024, you know, what's going through the mind of the governing party the day after losing these major metros?
Well, the first thing that should be going through the mind of the governing party is that it's not the center of the conversation today. Neither was it yesterday. The governing party was effectively sidelined from the center of politics, which is a shift in the political landscape. The second thing is that elections have consequences. Poor governance has consequences. And you cannot just assume that the voter is going to show up for you every time if you don't recognize the power of the voter. And then finally, that they're going to need to learn how to be in opposition as a party. We saw what happened in Ekurhuleni yesterday, where the ANC disrupted the meeting, throwing tables and chairs, its members, collapsing that meeting almost. And now it actually has been postponed to Wednesday. And so political tolerance and maturity from the part of the ANC, as it watches its role be transformed in this society and in our voting landscape, is going to be absolutely crucial for the future and stability of our country. The answer cannot be that if you don't vote for the ANC as a majority, then the whole country burns. That cannot be the way we go forward.
Tessa, 3 women mayors in the country's major metros. It's what we've been asking for in terms of representation?
In the words of the ANC song, Woman on Top. I think that it is a good day for gender representation in the country, regardless of how it was delivered. I think it's important that we see women occupying the highest offices in our country, and that we make sure that we are not just doing it in tokenistic ways, but that we are doing it in ways that show that there are capable women in our country who are able to lead at the highest levels, and that can shift the nature of politics and governance in the country. So we look forward to seeing what the outcomes are. And those are not only the only women that we saw in mayoral positions. We saw the EFF get their first mayoral position in a municipality in the Free State, and there was also a woman who was elected there. I think the more we see of this, the better. The fact that it didn't come through, for instance, the governing party just giving it through slates is significant, and I hope to see more of it.
Tessa Dooms, it's always a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for helping us understand these tectonic shifts that are taking place in our political landscape. She's a political analyst joining us there in the wake of those inaugural council meetings around the country. Tessa, thanks very much indeed.